Bene, cari colleghi, apriamo la terza sessione della nostra conferenza intitolata La revisione della strategia Europa 2020.
Review of 2020 strategy, growth, employment and competitiveness. We have four distinguished keynote speakers. First will be Carlo Padoan, who's Minister for the Economy and Finance Minister of Italy. Daniel Auroy, Chairperson of the European Affairs Committee, French National Assembly. Günther Kirschbaum, who's Chair of the Committee of the Affairs of the European Union at the German Bundestag, and Juan Moscoso de Prado Hernandez, who's Finance Committee and Foreign Affairs from the Finance Committee and Foreign Affairs Committee of the Spanish Congress. Before giving the floor to the speakers, I'd like to make a few brief introductory comments to this session, which, in my opinion, refers to the central issue in the current phase of European integration, the adoption of concrete measures and commitments to relaunch growth and employment in order to alleviate the social impact of the crisis and austerity on citizens. Many of our countries, as indicated in the biennial report prepared by the Secretariat, recognize that the pursuit of the goals of the 2020 strategy is unrealistic unless we change the economic policy framework, which has so far been pursued by the Union. I would like to point out two factors. In countries with the highest indebtedness, expenditure on research and development after the crisis has actually fallen instead of approaching the 3% goal. And in the whole Union, the people below the poverty threshold have dramatically increased instead of being reduced according to the strategy's targets. And so this shows that the public finance and economic policy so far followed produces pro-cyclical effects, being inspired essentially on a logic of austerity. And therefore, we need to find a balance between fiscal consolidation and relaunching the economy, accompanied by structural reforms, measures for an immediate stimulus to economic recovery by investments in sectors of high growth and employment potential. One initial step in this direction might be the concrete implementation of a major public and private investment program totaling 350 billion euros presented last week by the Commission. We should acknowledge the plan, which was urgently requested by Italy and other countries, particularly in southern Europe, is a major step forward in the Union's approach, which at last recognizes the need of actions on the demand side. At the same time, I wish to stress that there are too many unknown factors and gaps in the plan currently, starting from the over-optimistic, in my opinion, estimate of the leverage effect which would be generated by the 21 billion worth of guarantees offered by the European budget and the European Investment Bank, and particularly the voluntary nature of the investments of member states. I do not believe that these problems can be attributed to the European Commission. The basic problem is the attitude of our member states, which in the final instance are responsible to mobilize the European budget and other resources. Until some countries do not understand that the outcome of the European construction depends on a relaunch of investments and our economy, it will not be possible to undertake any effective strategy for growth and employment. Second important step for economic recovery would be a greater flexibility and graduality in the application of European public finance rules in reference to member states who have undertaken structural reforms and who also want to finance investments to relaunch growth and occupation. We need to acknowledge that the Juncker plan, for the first time, has excluded from the computations of debt thresholds the resources which member states allocate to investments as part of this plan. And I think that we need to extend this common sense rule to resources for co-funding investments which are supported by the structural funds of the European Union. With this, I'd like to give the floor to Minister Padoan for 15 minutes.
Grazie, Presidente. Onorevoli.
Thank you, President. Eminent members of Parliament, it's a great honour to speak to you in this at this venue, in this forum. I think the President's already pointed out that undoubtedly the issue of growth and employment should be centre stage of our discussion on European priorities. Today, the European Union is struggling, and this is something, unfortunately, which has been happening for a long time, to emerge from the extended crisis, which has made things very difficult for people seeking jobs or discouraged from seeking jobs. There are signs of recovery, but they're very weak. In my opinion, but not just my opinion, Europe is at a crossroads. Either it continues to crawl along a path of inadequate growth, or else it takes important decisions in order to undertake a more sustained growth. It's important to look to the past and recall that in the past the European Union often spoke of growth, but never placed growth, apart from a few exceptions, at the center of its agenda. And this is because growth was taken for granted as a result of the significant process of integration, which has always been central to the operations of the European Union. In the 80s, the problem begins to become visible, as some of you might recall. One fashionable term in the 80s was Eurosclerosis, the idea that Europe and the European continent as a whole was finding it difficult to keep up the pace with other more dynamic economies. And there was an important and strategic response to that, which was the internal market, which suggested a further integration of economies and made the single market as one of the pillars, single market and the single currency. So in the perspective of monetary union, economic and monetary union was seen as two things which complemented itself. In the early years of this century, there was another major effort undertaken, the Lisbon strategy or the Lisbon agenda, which again established a link between the prospects for growth and employment with what was then a strong signal from outside Europe, particularly from the United States, with the so-called new economy. A new economy based on innovation and ICT. It was a bold and important idea which perhaps had a limit in that, alongside the strategic lines for growth, it did not establish a sufficiently robust governance system which provided enough incentives for the member states, the European Union, to take the requisite decisions to put into practice the ideas of innovation with concrete effects on growth. So there's a problem of governance, and in my opinion, this is still central to European issues when we consider growth. However, in those years, Europe took a number of important governance-related decisions. First of all, the path towards monetary union, which led to the establishment of the European Central Bank and the system of European central banks, and then a system of governance which is complementary to the monetary union, which was considered to be indispensable for fiscal policies, with the Stability and Growth Pact, which was substantially targeted to ensure the sustainability of public finance, which quite rightly was seen to be as a necessary condition for the stability of the single currency. So there was a need to have the need to think of growth is not something new in the European debate. I simply wish to point out that today it's returned center stage to the discussion. It is become a central issue because of the dramatic nature of the lack of growth we see and also the lack of mechanisms to create jobs. And furthermore, it's enough to look back. Sometimes we look back regretfully to realize that Europe has progressively lost contact. There's been a progressive gap between the performance of the European economy and the reference economy, the US economy, over the decades. All data show that there's a fall in per capita GDP, overall income, and productivity when we compare the European economy and the US economy. It took the Great Recession to place the issue of growth high on the agenda. And this is something in a situation which is very different from what we had in the 80s and 90s. They use an expression which economists often use and which seems paradoxical. We both have a lack of demand in Europe and a lack of supply. We have a lack of aggregate demand, and this is something which we can quite clearly see when we look at the indicators we all look at, the output gap there is, and also the very worrying development of price dynamics, which lead us towards leads to the verge of deflation, which would be another reason for concern if we want to create jobs in Europe. But there's also a lack of supply of potential income, which means a lack of momentum in the capacity to invest in the European economy. And so we find ourselves with slow growth in demand, low growth in supply, and this all translates into a very scarce capacity to create jobs. This situation obviously is not the same for everybody. There are some countries which are doing better than others, and this is a reassuring fact, because there are obviously examples one can look at to try to import good practices. But I would say that the problem of governance and the basic philosophy of the European growth policy is the need not only to look with interest to companies which do better in terms of job creation, but we also need to ask ourselves another question: what is the European dimension of a growth policy? What can we do overall? Not so much as individual member states, but as European observers and policymakers to improve the situation we have before us. These issues have been placed in a central position in the debate by the Italian presidency, which began in July and which is about to come to its end. We've highlighted in ECOFIN, as far as I'm concerned, the issue of how we can construct a European growth strategy, and we indicated 3 lines of action. An initial thrust is structural reforms which can improve the productivity of countries and which can translate the European framework into profitability and effective plans. These plans have a typical European dimension, something which hasn't been considered enough, at least for one important reason. The degree of integration in Europe is so high that if in a country there's a structural reform program which generates positive results in terms of growth and employment, nearby countries benefit from it. And there is, therefore, as economists say, the possibility of exploiting spillovers, externalities, and therefore the possibility of looking to the consequences of the possibility of simultaneously implementing reforms on the part of several countries at the same time. A second pillar is related to an agenda which we've had for a number of years, but is still very valid, particularly because it is incomplete. This single market, the internal market, something was introduced in the 80s as a concept in order to attack the initial symptom of a slowdown in growth in Europe. There's a lot to be done in the internal market. It is something which is actually quite straightforward. The various phases of integration were stimuli for growth in Europe, and there are a lot of segments where in Europe we don't have an internal market. I'm thinking of a number of services, energy, and communications, for example. And there's huge potential for growth if we actually manage to move ahead in that direction. But integration also has a global dimension. Greater integration between the European economy as a whole and other economies, starting from the North American economy, would definitely have a major impact on growth. This is something which we can see from the many results of integration which we've applied in Europe and elsewhere. The third dimension is investments. If we look at the performance of advanced economies over the last 2 decades, we see that investments have fallen off everywhere, both public investments, also because of fiscal adjustments, and also private in the sector. In the absence of profit prospects has led to this. And so we would be responding to 2 goals. First, but with investments, we would stimulate demand, because investments are the immediate component of demand. It would also be a stimulus to supply, because increasing capital potential income is increased, and it will also make it possible to make use of the opportunities offered by a widespread structural reform policy. In this context, we mentioned the plan which was being suggested by President Juncker, and I think that we need to consider in greater detail how a policy of an investment policy, in the broadest sense, would be able to integrate or not with a structural reform program. And here we have a issue which is important in being able to adapt the economic governance of Europe. And here a 2020 review can be very important. There's one question which underscores operations which we're seeing, such as the Juncker program and the EIB task force established a few months ago. How can we in Europe re-establish a virtuous interaction between resources and bankable projects, projects which deserve to be funded by the banking and finance system? How can we establish this virtuous interaction? How, therefore, can we go beyond the debate, which, in my opinion, which I've had to deal with often, as to whether the problem is lack of resources or lack of projects in Europe? I think this is a false problem. We obviously need both. And may I say one thing? I'm convinced that if there were more profitable projects, well designed, well conceived, and presented by efficient administrations, there would be an impetus towards obtaining greater resources. I think this is a need which we have today, and it's a need which, if translated into practical terms, could accelerate and amplify the benefits of the Juncker plan. So I think this is a priority which should be central to a process of review of the 2020 Europe strategy, the Europe 2020 strategy. I'm moving to my conclusion. I apologize for the time I've taken, adding 2 things. In defining projects, it's important to link these projects to European priorities, and therefore an idea of an enlarged internal market. There are many areas. I've mentioned some: energy, but we can think of infrastructure sectors where public action can produce a lever effect We're not sure whether the numbers which have recently been presented are the right ones, but I don't think that's the main problem. The problem is identifying segments where public action, whether it be undertaken directly by governments or whether it be activated by bodies like the EIB, can make up for the lack of investments which the market is unable to produce itself, and where there is a market failure. How can public action fill this gap, therefore? And the second question, and with that I will conclude, all this needs to be placed within a longer term and broader perspective. I think that the serious, grave issue for the situation for economic governance in Europe requires reactions, and there are two areas in the long term which need to be pursued, but the long term begins today too. There are some elements beyond monetary union, beyond the internal market, which need to be pursued. So what I would call, with a common term, a union of capital markets, so that the financial instrument is truly placed in the service of growth. I think this is an important lesson from the financial crisis, and further on, concrete ways of achieving fiscal union, which obviously involve greater problems because they involve greater transfers of national sovereignty. But these are indispensable measures if we want to provide a credible perspective credible prospects for long-term growth in Europe. Thank you. Thank you. To Minister Padoan for this statement. I'd like to inform our colleagues that we've already got 25 people on our list of discussants. And considering time available, I would like to close the speaker list unless there's are some objections now. I'd like to move ahead, giving the floor to our colleagues Auroi, Krichbaum and Moscoso del Prado Hernandez, and I'd like them all to keep to 7 minutes. So,
Thank you, President. Thank you, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, delegates. Our Commission for European Affairs had its meeting in October. We had a consultation, according to the EP, with the mid-term review of the Europe 2020 strategy. I'm delighted to share with you today our reflections on this collective work, and I would thank the Italian presidency for giving me the opportunity to do so. The main fact which our Commission has noticed is the insufficient achievement of goals of the Europe 2020 strategy by stakeholders. I equally would like to congratulate the Italian presidency for the fantastic work which it has carried out, and I would ask all information related to the Council in relation to working on the Europe 2020 strategy in the various domains. So what is the outcome of the mid-term review? First of all, the principle of a strategy should not be undermined. It is crucial, in our opinion, that member countries reach an agreement on the priorities so that there is collective action over the long term. In terms of methods, the Europe 2020 strategy has called attention to the Lisbon strategy. When we look at the 5 objectives of the European strategy, it's clear that they respond to the needs of the European Union today. But we need to ensure that all of these goals are involved. In relation to the results, the implementation of this strategy is very disappointing. In terms of poverty and employment, Minister, you spoke a lot about the economy. I'm going to speak about poverty and employment. The midterm review is catastrophic in those terms. The number of people who are exposed to a risk of poverty in the Union has gone from to 124 million in 2012. And if I look at the good student of Europe, Germany, a huge proportion of the population are living below the poverty line. And yet Germany is the country that's supposed to be doing well. And so our countries which are doing less well are even more catastrophic. In terms of another point, it's really not doing well. Here we are seeing that youth are suffering because research is being neglected. In terms of macroeconomy, we have not achieved our objectives. It is necessary to ensure that Europe continues improving in that domain. We have had difficulties in implementing Europe 2020, and that's not just due to the current situation. I would focus on that point. Our strategy lacks visibility. It lacks more visibility than the Lisbon strategy. Often it is mixed up in France with the Horizon 2020 project or even with the energy climate package. I mentioned at the beginning that the Europe 2020 strategy has not seen real appropriation by stakeholders. I was shocked to see that when it was the famous investment plan was presented last week, President Juncker did not explicitly mention this strategy, even if the priorities defined are in the same line. It's also worrying to see that the reform programs are not clear enough. The objectives are not clear. The issue here is political will. We need political will from states and from the Commission to ensure that this strategy is a winning strategy. The recommendations of the European Commission on the latest reform program in France, for example, made lots of recommendations. However, there's nothing against the fight on climate change, and we're just a few months away from the COP meeting. This is something which I think needs to be taken as a priority. Media attention and the attention of the Parliament has shown that there are faults in the system. The only thing they seem to be interested in are the stability programs. All of the other objectives are neglected. I would like to remind you that the budget is a means, it's not an end in itself. And from that point of view, if we change the situation, if we mix up our means and our ends, then we're going to throw our European population into despair. The most classic example is that of expenditure on research. A group of states that wants to exist on an international stage cannot sacrifice research. It's impossible. It's sacrificing our future. So I think interesting paths forward were given in relation to the €300 billion investment and the contribution of member states to that, to the European capital funds, but that's not taken into account in the public deficit. This is a good news for states which are in difficulty, like Italy, France, Greece, Spain, and others. We need to use this opportunity to ensure that a place is made for the famous 3% deficit so that Europe 2020 expenses are taken on by states. We also need more transparency to ensure that things are clear. Debating Europe 2020 is also reflecting on what way we are going to move forward so that Europe finds a way to achieve smart, inclusive and sustainable growth. Our Commission firmly believes that this inclusive growth will only occur if we see the construction of a social Europe by implementing the Youth Guarantee Scheme and by ensuring a minimum wage. It's also urgent to better value your public assets, be they research, health, energy independence, the fight against climate change, or even the protection of Europe. We need to give the European Union the means to act, particularly in terms of the budget. Our Commission regrets that heads of state and governments are having an MFF for 2014 to 2020, and yet they have not taken on the initial reports of the Commission. The investment plan proposed last week goes in the right direction. We need to prioritise energy, among others. However, that will not be sufficient if we do not have the will to reassess this 2020 strategy in all of its aspects, and if there are no means to ensure that the EU can move forward by giving everyone the will to continue together. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. And now our colleague Kirschbaum.
Herr Präsident, Herr
President, distinguished minister, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. In our constituencies, we're often asked, even the Pope said this in his address to the European Parliament, we are often asked about our visions of the European Union. Actually, there are lots of visions with respect to the European Union. There's the dimension of Northern Africa in the European neighborhood policy. And I think, well, if that isn't a vision, having Africa as part of our neighborhood policy, then what is a vision? Then we also have a vision with respect to our eastern partnerships, the eastern borders of the European Union. Those are places where we want to create peace and stability and maintain them and enforce them so that we can all live in peace and stability. And that will only be possible if there's peace and stability beyond our borders as well. And we have a further vision. We have the vision that the European continent, the European Union, becomes the most growth-promoting and innovative region in the whole world. And these visions, ladies and gentlemen, are supposed to be carried forward with strategies, and these strategies are to be carried forward with initiatives. And these strategies are supposed to lead us to become the economically strongest and prosperous and most innovative region of the world. That is the strategy Europe 2020. Now, the issue here, however, is how serious do we take ourselves? How serious do we take ourselves when the issue is to look at the goals which we have defined for ourselves, which we also need to fulfill, by the way? And of course, here we need to have a close look at things and admit to ourselves that we're not keeping up with our promises. One thing is true. We need more growth. And more growth must lead to more employment and more stability. It's the only way forward. And this is why, when we reduced our common currency, the euro, we decided that we needed the Stability and Growth Pact as a basis. And the Stability and Growth Pact is not so bad. It's not all that bad, and it never has been all that bad. 60% is our debt quota. 60%. Why 60%? Because 60% at the time was the average percentage of indebtedness for countries within the Eurozone. And we had agreed on one thing, and that was that we didn't want even more debt. We wanted to more or less maintain the limit at that 60% mark. And even back then, we were trying to integrate this hidden debt break or limit, if you will. Then we also had the 3% deficit criterion. Some of the things we heard this morning, this afternoon, have already shown that it's important to remember what our history is in that respect as well. That 3% mark was a conscious way of saying, well, if we have to really take those 3% and go into debt to that extent, then that money has to be invested in technology and innovation and in employment, in jobs for the future. In other words, what this means is that it's precisely what people are asking for now. And it's already in those 3%. It's been incorporated, integrated in those 3%. We did that long ago, but we seem to have forgotten about it. And this is why it's important to remind ourselves of this. And this is also true of the Stability and Growth Pact, which is really not that bad. I'm sorry. Up to now, it's been violated 60 times, and not one single time was anyone punished for those violations. So what I'm saying is that I think something else is lacking. Credibility is lacking, because with our own rules, if we're taking our own rules and not taking them seriously, not taking ourselves seriously, therefore, how can we expect others in the world to take us seriously? This is one of the reasons why we got into this economic and financial crisis in the first place. We have to learn to respect the rules that we set ourselves. That would make us more credible. and it would also make us more worthy of confidence and trust. And this also applies to the strategy 2020, Europe 2020, sorry. Now, what we need in this respect is the following. We need structural reforms. We need structural reforms which make growth possible, which make employment possible, which make job creation possible, and often they don't cost a thing, nothing, zero. Every country within the country-specific recommendations which are given in the framework of the European semester has to know what it's doing individually. So countries have to keep a grip on their own situation, obviously, but at the same time, we have the European semester as a framework, which is a framework strategy. And by defining this strategy, we made a contribution to saying that we want the Commission to tell us what the deficits are that we have to abolish. So part of it is certainly our fault. We have to admit that. And therefore, I think it's a good idea to review these rules and to try and actually apply them within the Europe 2020 strategy. However, there are quite a few obstacles to be overcome in this respect. And I know that in many countries there are difficulties. There are big problems. But just another word about the structural reforms. All of this starts with the employment markets. Not everything that is good for those who already have a job is also good for those who don't have a job. There are opportunities we need to avail ourselves of. Let me just remind you that, for example, in Germany, we have the dual vocational training system, which we've had for many years in Germany, which helps young people into the employment market by sending them to school and to work at the same time. And our youth employment is still too high in Germany. There's no doubt about that, but it's better than in other countries. And what I'm saying is that it's a common European task that we have to fulfill. This is a concern we have to tackle together. And the youth employment needs to be tackled, especially in those countries where the situation is particularly precarious. We have to try and solve that problem together. Because when you have youth unemployment at 50% and more, that is unacceptable for us as Europeans. We have to show solidarity in the face of this situation toward each other, because not only are young people unemployed here, what we have here is a societal explosive. So if you look at the strategy, Europe 2020, I think that we have a very good strategy there. We don't need to redefine it. We need to apply it. We have to be serious about actually achieving the targets that we've set ourselves so that this Europe can actually really and truly become one of the most prosperous parts of this world. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Moscoso del Prado has the floor.
Good afternoon, President. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you today, representing the Spanish Parliament. Now it's better for everyone if I speak in Spanish. Ladies and gentlemen, Europe needs common solutions to our common problems. That is Europe. The main problem Europe has today is a lack of growth. This is a shared problem, a problem which we are not tackling from a common point of view. From the European institutions, we're not doing that. This problem of growth is a problem involving a lack of growth. It's a shared problem which can only be tackled together. It's going to lead to a collapse of our social and societal model. It's going to lead to more inequality, a collapse into the vicious cycle of deflation, stagnation, a rise in Euroscepticism and populism, and the failure of the euro and even perhaps Europe's irrelevance on the global stage. The role which Europe has played in the recent G20 meeting in Brisbane shows this. The objectives in the Europe 2020 strategy, unfortunately, today go against what we are doing. What should Europe do to ensure that it can escape this risk of deflation and stagnation? First, I think we need a clear drive in our aggregate demand, as our minister mentioned. Last week in Washington, the meeting with American economists, they said that today aggregate demand is 98% in Europe and 2% of reform. I think they might have been exaggerating, but they were going in the right direction. Second, we need to change our political route because we are causing injustice. We are showing the uselessness of austerity, and we are seeing a decline in salaries and inequality. My French colleague mentioned that we need to strengthen our reforms and back them up with reform and financing to ensure that we have quality employment. What about aggregate demand? Since 2008, nominal demand in the Eurozone has only grown by 12.2% over 6 years, and nominal GDP in 6 years has only grown by 5%. We are almost 20 points below the objectives outlined by Europe for each year. If we sum up growth and inflation, that's 20 points in 6 years. Investment in 2014 is going to be 500 billion less than 27. Since 27, investment is going to be half, 300 billion euro less than 27. So Juncker's plan is good, but it's not going to stop the fall in investment since 2007. The European Investment Bank, for example, in 2013 is invested less than in 29. So we need to invest, which will increase our productivity, our potential for growth, increase salaries, and ensure quality employment in education, research, development, PME, small and medium enterprises. We need to ensure labour mobility, social inclusion, and we need to increase our GDP by allowing more women access to the work market. By increasing the participation of women in the work market, we will increase GDP and labour productivity. For reform, we shouldn't just be talking about reforming the labour market. We have the 3/3 rule. Competitiveness depends on labour costs, capital costs, and energy costs. If we reduce just labour costs, then we are going to lose competitiveness and we create low-quality employment that is incompatible in the medium term with sustainable and long-term growth, and it goes against our welfare state. The next third, capital costs, does not just include financial costs. A Spanish or French small and medium enterprise pays less than a German one. This will affect innovation, and investment in education, etc. And this could also lead to a lack of savings in public expenditure. Third, energy. With shale gas in US, the cost of energy in the US is going to be 1/3 that of EU and 1/5 of that in Japan. So we're going to see how this is going to affect investment. In Spain, we can see the importance of accompanying reform with investment. I come from a region in Spain called Navarra. In Navarre, unemployment in 2017 was 4%. In Andalusia, it was 13%. Today in Navarre, it's 15%, and in Andalusia, it's 35%. But in both regions, then and now, we had the same employment legislation. We had the same unions. We had the same business people. We had the same collective negotiation system. So it's not all about reforming the labour system, because in both regions, we've seen investment in infrastructure, in economic development, etc. All of this depends on investment which is lacking in Europe. We need an impulse in demand. We need investment for productivity and to ensure that our society remains open. I want to focus a little bit on economic governance. As the President said, the consequences of austerity and economic policies are oftentimes worse than the crisis itself. We need a fiscal impulse. We need to look at some figures first. In Germany, since 2022, we have seen a surplus equivalent to 87% of German GDP. That's more than the French GDP. In Germany, since 2002, net investment has been negative. So Germany is not investing to improve its labour productivity. Germany had average inflation of 1%, and this was forcing countries in the south to go into deflation so that they could gain some competitiveness within a model that only allows us to reduce costs via labour investment, because we're not investing in labour or energy. We need more efficient growth policies. We need more innovation in small and medium enterprises, more investment also in ensuring that we reduce unemployment. In Spain, we've reduced investment in education from 5.3% of GDP to 3.9% of GDP, so that's almost a third. That is not the way forward. This is a policy brought on by Europe that is focused on liberalism, a dogma that lacks recipes to allow us to exit this situation. We have a demand crisis, and at the same time we have a lack of liquidity. So in the midterm review of the 2020 strategy, we need to ask, is this the economic policy which we need to achieve our objectives? Is the policy which European citizens deserve? That's all. Thank you.
Grazie.
Many thanks to all our keynote speakers, and I'll open the discussion. As I already said, there's 35 speakers on our list, and therefore I'll give the floor to our colleagues for 1 minute and allow the key speakers to reply for 5 minutes. The first of our, if you agree with the times I've allotted, first speaker on the list is Maria Rodriguez, Deputy President of the Employment Committee at the European Parliament and also Vice President of the Social Democratic Group. She has Socialist and Democratic Group. She has great long-standing experience in the development and implementation of the Lisbon strategy before and Europe 2020 later.
Easier to be understood. As we could see in this panel, we have different assessments of the situation. As I was involved in this process since the beginning, 2000, let me just start by recalling that the central goal of the Europe 2020 strategy and the Lisbon strategy in 2000 was very simple, was to build a new way for the European economy to be competitive and to create jobs of the future and sustain the welfare system. The problem is we need to have a good balance to achieve these goals, and we need to have strong means, financial means and political means. I think we need to be precise on the assessment of the Lisbon strategy and now the Europe 2020 strategy. And I will say like that. Let's not forget that before the financial crisis of 2007, we were having net job creation in Europe. 16 million jobs were there, and the average growth rate was 2.7. Of course, then we had the financial crisis, and on the top of that, the Eurozone crisis. My very quick explanation for this is like that. The Lisbon strategy was designed as a strategy combining reforms and investments with a responsible fiscal consolidation. But the means for that were quite weak. After that, the Europe 2020 strategy forgot about investment because of the crisis, but investment disappeared from the language of Europe 2020 strategy. Now, I think for the next phase, we need to, again, to recall this is about combining investments, reforms, and responsible fiscal consolidation. We need this balance. And if I connect with our discussion this morning on what can be done by members of national parliaments and members of European Parliament, I believe that European Parliament should deal with the European Council and the Council as a whole, and of course with the European Commission, giving its contribution directly with these bodies. If you think about national governments, of course they are dealing with the European Commission according to the Lisbon Treaty, but they are particularly responsible to deal with the national governments. So I'm coming with concrete suggestions on what can be done by members of the national parliaments if you want to have a better balance in new financial means. I would say that, first of all, first step is that if you want to have stronger priority for investment and job creation, this is the moment to act close to your governments, because the annual growth survey was just now presented by the European Commission. So you can send this message to your governments. If you want to have strong initiatives in this strategy for energy transition or digital agenda or education, you need to make it clear to your governments when they will discuss this in the Council of Ministers and the European Council. These Europe 2020 initiatives will come. And if you want to make sure that you have stronger means to invest, I would advise you that now, on the run-up to the European Council, you just say close to your governments that the national contributions for the Juncker investment plan should be excluded from the deficit and the debt. So this is the way to reconcile our aim of getting back to recovery and jobs creation on one hand and rebalancing the budgets on the other hand. Thank you very much.
Grazie. Adesso...
Thank you. Now we can move on to the next discussants, 1 minute each. Josef Horvat as first speaker from Slovenia.
Spoštovani gospod predsedujoči, spoštovani gospod minister, drage kolegice in kolegi. Zahvaljujem se Italiji, našim sosedom in prijateljem za
I'd like to thank Italy,
ki je povedal.
May I thank our neighbours and friends for all the efforts they have done, and I cannot agree more with the President of the Senate who has said Europe should change, otherwise it shall be no more. I also am saying that Europe should digitalise. Our goals in Europe 2020 are goals for better Europe. All of us, namely us, dear colleagues, in the spirit of the Lisbon Treaty, bear enormous responsibility for the implementation of this strategy. I would like to put forward the digital agenda, which is one of the flagship initiatives for Europe 2020. Our world is going to be digital. The one who is not going digital shall be no more. But are we going to be able to digitalize Europe by 2015? Do we understand digital society correctly? What in the past electrification and construction of railways meant has today been replaced by the construction of fast and ultra-fast internet networks, and above all, the applications that are meant to improve the lives of our citizens. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. And now Norbert Spinrath from Germany.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you very much indeed. I think Mr. Moscoso showed us very clearly how low investment levels still are in Europe. And of course, they fell drastically in the time after 2007. And this is probably, as my colleague Krischbaum also said, due to the fact that we don't take our own goals seriously enough. And this is something that we really need to remember and see what we can do about it. Now, I can only say a few things because I don't have very much time. Of course, we have to stick to our own rules. However, rules that were defined 5, 6, or 7 years ago referred to a world that no longer exists. We have to now adjust those rules. This may well succeed with the Stability and Growth Pact, which envisages flexibility and gives us room for maneuver. It's not only stability, but also a growth pact. And that is very important. We have to use these opportunities. We have to make sure that we reduce bureaucracy and move our economies forward so that we just talk about doing these things, but actually move on to doing things in practice. If we want Europe in which services are offered at very low prices and very low wages are paid, and at the same time no taxes are paid, how are things going to work? We want good jobs, good work, good wages and salaries on which we can actually collect taxes. And this is something that we need to keep in mind when talking about the Stability and Growth Pact and also when talking about the employment market and industry and research. These are things we have to not just talk about, but actually do in practice.
Thank you. Now Sir William Cash, UK.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my opinion, over-regulation destroys jobs, and we need oxygen for the small and medium-sized businesses. Not one penny of public expenditure for any public investment whatsoever comes from anything other than the tax profits of business, and in particular, small and medium-sized businesses. If anybody here believes that it comes from anywhere else other than printing money, then please let me know. The reality, therefore, is that we need to have a deregulation program which will enable us oxygen for small and medium-sized businesses in particular to generate the jobs for the growth that is needed. And this is a practical solution which is not contained, in my opinion, in the proposal for mobilizing 300 billion euros in additional public and private investment. I shall be putting down an amendment to that effect when I have the opportunity to do so later. I want to have a free enterprise, jobs, growth, democratic Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Mr. Rakakis from Greece.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to congratulate the Italian presidency for the excellent organization of this event, and I'd like to also say something about 2 points which I think are of vital importance to all of us. In the economic crisis, according to recent statistics, we are coming farther and farther away from the goals we set ourselves for Europe 2020 on a national and a European level in the employment sector, but also with respect to poverty and social exclusion. The gaps between the member states are growing, especially between the north and the south of Europe. In Greece, in this year, after 5 years of recession, we now have an economic growth rate which is still very low, 2.9%, nevertheless, and it's over the average of the European Union. At the same time, we are being subjected to austerity measures which will push us back into recession, despite everything we've achieved, and this will lead to a collapse of the social Europe. We must recognize that. At the same time, we're saying that we're supposed to have social priorities. How are we supposed to achieve this? How are we supposed to respect these principles if we're not given the economic possibilities to do so? And obviously, there's no way we can achieve structural reforms if we move forward in this fashion. Thank you.
Thank you. Eileen Hayden, Ireland.
Thank you, Presidency, for the opportunity to contribute to this debate. Ireland believes that the headline targets in the strategy continue to be relevant. However, we believe that consideration should be given to introducing qualitative measures within the targets. as numerical values can be one-dimensional and are not a sufficient measure of progress. For example, we believe that a jobs quality target should be introduced to promote the sustainability of jobs. We strongly believe that the strategy should move away from a one-size-fits-all approach in achieving targets, that it is vital to address regional inequalities within the EU. It is also our view that the Member States will more likely not achieve the strategy targets if implementation continues to be centre-driven with a top-down approach. This, we believe, is a weakness of the strategy. As our Greek colleague has said, over 120 million Europeans are living in poverty today. There are less people working and more people at risk of poverty and social exclusion than when the strategy was agreed. We also recommend that the social indicators as set out in the Alert Mechanism report should be used to monitor any negative social outcomes and to promote positive measures on poverty, equality and social exclusion. I thank you for this opportunity to address this issue today.
Grazie. Adesso la collega Miller.
Thank you. Now, colleague Miller from Finland.
Puheenjohtaja. Thank you, Chairman. I am happy for Mr. Juncker's initiative to create investment in Europe. Here, both European decision-making and national action need to go hand in hand. And here is something where we can find our common dimension for growth in Europe. We need mutual trust in Europe in order to create structural reforms. For those countries where they can afford to invest, should invest now. This is how we create demand, and only supplementary demand can create new products. This investment package has to be combined to Europe 2020 strategy, and this strategy will bring the substance to this investment package. We need new energy skills, new energy resources, energy efficiency, and first and foremost, we need work for our young people. Thank you.
Adesso il collega Gamo della Svezia.
Now, colleague Gamo from Sweden.
Tack, herr ordförande.
Thank you, Chair. Here I represent, I believe, others than my own political party, and I think I'm representing the Swedish line. I would like to say a few things on the European investment policy. I think that today we allocate way too much tax money from the European Union to this. And the plans that we've heard from Juncker, well, I think that that is something that will be questioned by all politicians taking their responsibility. Of course, the European 2020 strategy should be reformed or abolished. We see EU being more and more bloated, and why? I feel that we need more collaboration between states. We do not need more supranationality. We need to look at the financial policy in the European Union, and we do not need more integration, but we need to collaborate between states, and the individual member states need more influence. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Ramazan Noglu from Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We consider that the targets of Europe 2020 guide us for balanced growth at both national and EU levels. My country, Turkey, has achieved significant progress until now as a candidate for the membership of the EU. Since the last 10 years, Turkey's efforts regarding all recommended fields are 4 times higher than before. This ensures the continuation of our long-lasting cooperation with the EU on a sustainable basis. Thus, we fully welcome the Commission's regulations to find out the right ways to manage the challenges facing the EU. Now, I will ask 2 very important questions, and I expect very clear answers, please. The first question: how far and how well will be the position of my country, Turkey, in the strategic procedure of Europe 2020? The second question, what will be positively different and happy for Turkey in the EU at the end of the year 2020? Thank you in advance for your answers.
Thank you. Trantafyllos from Greece.
Thank you very much. Distinguished colleagues, we all see the same side of the moon, so to speak. We're all on the same continent. When we look at the moon, we see the same moon. So what about the Europe 2020 strategy? We have the same problems. We recognize the same problems with respect to the economy, society, poverty, the social system, and so on and so forth. I mean, is there any way that anyone could have an advantage to someone else's disadvantage? If someone else doesn't do well, it's bad for all of us in our community, in our European Union. That is certainly true with respect to the 2020 agenda and with respect to the European semester. Any sort of one-sided, monolithic approach is wrong for everyone. It will not lead to economic growth. If we want a banking union in order to have money cost less in certain countries and to make it more expensive in other countries, how can it be that we would ever achieve any progress towards the goals of the Europe 2020 strategy? That would never happen.
Thank you. And now Sita from Sweden.
Thank you. Since I first started with politics 20 years ago, everybody has been talking about growth, structural reforms of the EU and the labor market and all that, and I have seen very little happen with that. Why not use now the chance for recovery by resource efficiency? We have no chance to recover economically as long as we depend on import of gas and uranium from Russia or from oil from the Middle East. We have a unique opportunity now with high unemployment rate and low interest rates to do a cost-effective investment pact with resource efficiency and renewables. No country can monopolize the wind, the sun, or the waves. A growing economy that increases the import of raw materials and fossil fuels damages not only our chances to economic recovery and employment, but also our ability to have an independent foreign policy. Let us focus more on what needs to be done and less on growth itself. If people and countries pursue their objectives with creativity, more jobs will come and the economy will recover with it. Grandiose and centralized plans for detailed and complex change for 2020 will not. Thank you.
Grazie. Adesso il collega Stubgen.
Thank you. Michael Stubgen, Germany.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident.
Thank you very much. I would like to explicitly and expressly thank Minister Paduan for his talk and for his reference to the 3 pillars. And since I don't have much time, I'll just say something about structural reforms, his first point. I see a bit of a danger there because for a few years now we've had this so-called European semester. And every year the European Commission adopts this decision on behalf of the Council as well, and gives us these so-called country-specific recommendations. And wherever there's high unemployment and economic growth trouble, the same recommendations, more or less, are issued every year. You have to have a better performing public administration. You have to have a better pension system. You have to cut pensions, and you have to fight corruption. Fine, that all sounds good. The trouble is, in the governments and in the parliaments of these member states, not even 10% of the recommendations are taken on board. So the development goes in the following direction. The European semester has become a pile of paper. It's nice for European bureaucrats, but no one's doing anything with this paper. It's just bureaucracy. So I'm sorry. These recommendations of the European semester have to find a very clear place in the national parliaments. Of course, you can't apply every single one of the recommendations. Not all of them are correct. But they have to be dealt with. Otherwise, we won't have the basis that we need for economic growth. And otherwise, investment strategies will not work.
Thank you. Kevin Hopkins, UK.
Thank you, Mr. President. There is constant talk in European Union institutions of boosting growth and reducing unemployment, and yet nothing really changes. The Eurozone is an economic failure and has led directly to mass unemployment, low and sometimes negative growth, and now a slide into deflation. Countries in southern Europe are suffering terrible privations in particular, but even Germany is now being affected. With deflation in the EU, China's slowing economy and recession in Japan, the world looks as though it is edging towards another crisis. The countries of Europe need desperately to be able to expand their economies, and yet are having austerity forced upon them and cannot escape unless they are able to regain control of the macroeconomic levers of power, which must include the ability to flex national currencies to appropriate parities, to set their own interest rates and to decide their own fiscal policies. All of this is impossible in the Eurozone, and it is significant that Britain has ridden the economic storm after the 2008 crisis much better than elsewhere in the EU. We depreciated our currency after 2008, and had we not been able to do so, we would be experiencing a crisis just like the Eurozone economy. There is a lesson there. Mr. Timmermans talked before lunch about giving our children a better future. What future is that when large parts of Europe have up to 50% and more of young people unemployed? In the post-war Europe, we had full employment, substantial economic growth, the creation of welfare states and rising living standards. That world worked. The world we have now does not.
Grazie. Adesso il collega Fotiu.
Thank you. Fotiu from Grace, please.
La collega.
Thank you. In this week, the Greek government is bringing the budget for the year 2015 into the Hellenic Parliament for adoption. Spending for education research is being cut by 10%, and it's been down 30% since the beginning of the economic crisis in Greece. No exceptions are made for education and research in the memorandum. How can we seem credible vis-à-vis the Greek people with respect to the 2020 agenda when the official percentages for research are 0.60% and when the investments made in this area are way below the European average? Obviously, countries which are at an economic disadvantage can't have the same competitiveness as other countries. They are in a situation of inequality. Obviously, they don't have the same priorities, and therefore the same priorities cannot be given to them under the Europe 2020 agenda. So I wonder, and this is my question, how do you intend to reestablish and redefine the priorities and the goals in the Europe 2020 agenda in order to accommodate the situation of these countries?
Thank you. Colleague Schrever from the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. My remarks relate to the use of EU funds at national level, a topic which was also briefly addressed by Prime Minister Renzi this morning. In our view, part of the review of the 2020 strategy should relate to improving transparency towards our citizens and accountability of national governments towards the European Commission as well as their national parliaments on the use or sometimes underutilization of EU funds such as the European Social Fund or the European Regional Development Fund. The two houses of the Netherlands Parliament urge each national government to issue an official national declaration on the use of such EU funds at national level. And I ask the panel, do you agree with this? And I also inform you that we have submitted an amendment to this extent for an additional paragraph in the contribution of COSAC. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Piskupic, Slovakia.
Thank you very much. I would like to follow up to Mr. Kirchbaum. I fully agree with how he defined the vision or strategy or the implementation through initiatives or implementation. However, I have a small criticism. Even if we agree that we have to respect the rules and we have to abide by the rules if we set them for ourselves. We need real instruments. Whether we talk about Africa or whether we speak about our European neighborhood, immediate European neighborhood. If we do not have real instruments, authentic economic diplomacy, for example, with some countries of Africa, where we could act as a European community when we're looking for new markets, maybe that would be at the expense of bilateral agreements, but this might be our main challenge, and that's why the instruments to implement the visions of strategies and initiatives, they should be more realistically reflected in the instruments that we have to develop as soon as possible. The area where I come from, we have quite negative experience with 5-year planning of the economy or society. It doesn't give good preconditions. Maybe, maybe it doesn't mean that 10-year strategies will be positive. Thank you.
Friedrich della Germania.
Thank you, Peter Friedrich, Germany.
Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
President, distinguished colleagues. The U.S. automobile industry was in decline in the 1980s, and at the time, the leader of Chrysler said that, well, the trouble isn't the stock market. The trouble is that we're not building good cars. And this reminds me of the situation today with the European economy, because it's nice to listen about all these discussions about the macroeconomy. But what we have to ask ourselves, what do we want to produce? What sort of services do we want to offer in order to be competitive on the world market? How can we keep up with respect to India and China? If we don't do better, we have to be more innovative and produce better quality products than in other parts of the world. We need skilled people to do this. We need good engineers, and we need investment in training, education, and in research above all. So the question is, how can we get our European institutions to approve a strategy that promotes precisely that, education and training and technology, innovation, research? Because this is what we need. This is why we're so far behind in Europe today, and this is why we're not in a position today to make the investments that we need to make in the areas that are in need of funds. Often, however, funds are there and they don't go in the right direction. Often we're not even in a position to absorb the funds that have actually been earmarked, and therefore we need to do something about the administrative capacities of Europe as well.
Portugal. Thank you. Now, Nuno Matias from Portugal.
Presidente.
Thank you, President. Europe was a beacon for the world for values, discoveries, and development, but our central role has been lost to some extent in the attempt to achieve the goals of the 2020 strategy, even though these goals were indicated as new opportunities. Without growth, employment and competitiveness, these goals will never be achieved. Our economies will not be able to grow. The word competitiveness is important in order to ensure more enterprise and growth. And we need to answer the following question. How will the new European fund launched by the Commission last week, as well as trade agreements and our partnership with Canada, which has already been signed, and the agreements with the United States and Mercosur, will be able to ensure new productivity conditions, new market access, and therefore the recovery of economic performance, so that we in Europe can continue to be a beacon. Mr. LII from Slovakia.
About social Europe, but I have an amendment. We are discussing social exclusion of the poor and unemployed people. But moreover, we should maybe see also the exclusion of the employees themselves, the exclusion from the decisions and ownership in companies. I remember the idea of the Swedish trade unionist intellectual Rudolf Meidner. He said, "First of all, we fought for political democracy, then for social democracy, and the last stage, and the most important, is economic democracy." It means the workers' participation on decisions in companies, so-called co-determination. It also means the cooperative ownership. It also means the workers' self-management. The European Union is exhausted by the never-ending debates about political democracy. Let's talk more about social and economic democracy. How it is possible that in the public sector the democracy is necessity, but in the companies there is still autocracy and nobody cares. This is the question of Rudolf Meidner, which he wanted to solve by the creation of the Swedish Workers' Fund. According to me, such workers' funds in pan-European scale could lead us to more growth, more social justice, more equality, inclusion, more democracy, all the values covered by Europe 2020. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. And now our colleague Harakopoulos from Greece.
Thank you very much indeed, dear colleagues. The challenge we need to rise to is that of economic growth. Prime Minister Renzi said this morning, and rightly so. He said economic growth is blocked in Europe today, especially in Greece. This is true. And the creation of new jobs is a target for us which we need to be able to achieve in order to survive. Obviously, the economic crisis has hit us all, in some countries harder than others, and austerity policy, distinguished colleagues, is not the only way out of the crisis. We need a new policy in Europe. We need a new policy which will help us create healthy forces of protection, which can help us overcome the liquidity deficit and help us set up new programs for economic growth. If this does not happen, I'm afraid that Euroscepticism and populist forces will bring the European house down. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Now, Edmund Wittbrod from Poland.
Proszę Państwa, Europa 2020, strategia.
Thank you. Europe 2020 is the most important instrument in economic policy. We have great hopes, but it's not just a matter of growth and employment. But I agree with our German colleagues that it is the global dimension of innovation and research which is essential. I'd like to recall that the Europe 2020 strategy is different from the Lisbon strategy, because here there's a greater role for member states, and it also depends on the way reforms are implemented. Last week we had our committee meeting, and we analyzed the situation from the point of view of what needs to be done on the European level still. We need to link European semesters with this strategy to reduce the fiscal burden in order to construct infrastructures, and we're very glad about the increase in investments and the European Investment Fund. Thank you.
Obrigada, Presidente. Estamos aqui hoje a falar de crescimento, emprego, mas não podemos deixar que...
We're here to speak about growth and employment, but as other representatives have said, we cannot neglect the European side with regard to growth and employment. The 2020 strategy has not been a success, far from it. We have 25 million unemployed in Europe, more than 20% of young people who have no kind of job, more than 8 million young people who have no activity, and in terms, and the data in general, very discouraging. Children are threatened by social exclusion and poverty, and a situation which is very similar in Portugal. In Portugal, there are more than 1 million people who live in a situation of poverty. More than 30% of children live in a condition of social inclusion. Now, speaking of growth and employment, the problem which needs to be clarified is the following. With the financial instruments developed by the European Union, the budget compact six-pack and two-pack, how can we speak of prospects for growth and more employment when in fact these instruments have led to stagnation, austerity, recession, unemployment and therefore poverty?
Casado della Spagna.
Mr. Casado from Spain.
Thank you, President. We live in a globalized world, and in the last weeks we've seen two important moments. These show a graphic situation of Europe. First, we had the G20 summit. We saw that we need to have the Growth and Stability Pact in line with our other plans and with the Juncker plan. We've also talked about structural reforms, which have an electoral and citizen cost, but they are key. In the G20 summit, we talked about economic growth and creation of employment. I would say there were key points. First of all, the TAPE agreement, the figures there are incredible. We're talking about the creation of 2.5 million jobs. We're talking about increasing global employment, and we're talking about increasing finances. I think we should not let this opportunity pass by, particularly when we're seeing that these treaties would expand on the current TAPE model. In terms of energy, this directly affects competitiveness, particularly in relation to supply of energy when we see conflict in Eastern Europe. Spain is linked to North Africa, and we have asked our partners, particularly France, to ensure that there are interconnections and networks for the benefit of everyone. Thank you.
Grazie. Adesso Hansen.
Thank you. Now Mr. Hansen from Norway.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for inviting the Norwegian Parliament. As the Prime Minister and the Minister said, growth, economic growth and employment, job creating has to be at the center stage, not only in the European Union, but also in each member state. TTIP is meant to contribute to this, and Norway is affected as a member of the internal market through the EEA agreement. We therefore welcome the new Trade Commissioner's intention to keep an open dialogue with the EEA-EFTA countries on this. We also welcome that during the Italian presidency, the EU and the EU-EFTA states has managed to agree on our participation in the EU financial supervisory structure. And finally, let me emphasize the importance of good cooperation between Norway and the EU on energy and climate issue. Norway and EU are close partners in the global climate negotiation and should work together for an ambitious deal in Paris next year. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Jean Bizet, France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le
Thank you, President, Minister, colleagues. The Lisbon strategy brought about a lot of hope. Unfortunately, it led to a lot of disappointment. And we need to ensure that this is in line with our Europe 2020 strategy. First, a lot of us have already mentioned this. We need to really focus on research and development. 3% is not enough. I would agree with what our German colleague has said, or Austrian colleague, sorry. Second, we need to invest within a European Union for energy. We can see that if we don't have cheap energy, then we're going to see delocalization of energy from Europe to the US. The third point relates to digital and internet. These two activities are at the heart of the modernity of our economies. Without talking about sovereignty or independence, there is certainly a part of Europe here where we need to reinvest. We need to reinvest in the governance of internet and the digital world. Europe must have its own funds to do this, but Europe is not daring in that regard. We need to create our own resources for the Union.
Thank you. And the last speaker is from my colleague Neofito from Cyprus.
President, what I have to say may seem a bit strange to you, because I come from the country which was perhaps most hard hit by Troika measures. However, economic growth is something that I believe that we have to achieve based on budget discipline and putting our public finances back on a healthy footing. It's the only way to go. We're talking about reforms, but we need to stop talking about reforms. We have to start actually carrying out reforms. We're an old continent in Europe. We're no longer competitive. This has to change. We have to work hard in order to regain our competitivity, and our priority must be the digital agenda. We have to reduce our costs. It's the only way forward, the only way in which we can have a Europe with economic growth.
Many thanks to all the colleagues who have taken the floor. Now we will move to the replies, and I'll give the floor to Mr. Pandoan first. Thank you, President. I'd like to thank all the honourable MPs who have taken the floor. It's a very plentiful discussion, so I won't be able to reply to all the points, but I'd like to make a general comment. Obviously, there are a lot of different positions expressed in your comments, but I think that everybody in this room is interested in building a more efficient and effective Europe as a system producing wealth and employment. There are three issues, I think, which have emerged, which I simply want to list. The first is whether the European solution should be the result of a sum of national policies, or whether it should also be the result of a authentically European policy. So what value you want to attribute to further integration and the construction of further institutions. I think that my preference is clear. A national solution on the part of everybody is fundamental, necessary, but it's not sufficient. The second issue is the complexity of the problems which face us. Unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion that there's no magic wand which can take Europe back onto the path to growth and employment, as occurred in the past when it was very efficient. Faced by such a complex and severe crisis, we need to make use of all the tools available, and this is a challenge to legislators to see how the various tools can be connected together. The 2020 strategy, in my opinion, has this ambition of defining a common framework in which all the instruments from budgetary policy to financial policy to structural policies, and obviously in the case of the monetary union, monetary policy, also for other countries, all these things should be made to strengthen each other. But as I said, there's no magic wand. We need to all shoulder these responsibilities. And the third point concerns incentives. What leads countries to adopt different policies and change their direction? The major incentive, unfortunately, to changing course is a crisis, when we have an intense crisis of the kind which has affected certain countries in Europe. There is a greater speed of change, but that doesn't mean that we need more crises for more change. And in fact, this is the most important lesson I take from the crisis. All countries need to step up their change, including countries who've been less affected or who've been spared by the crisis. I think that this is the main lesson we need to draw from the crisis. And we also, there's another implication, I think, which is that better integration also means the establishment of common institutions, which may be different because of the different positions of the countries here in Europe. At the same time, institutions can be a major incentive to take the right economic policy and social policy decisions. And this is something which needs to be done, thinking that common institutions should be the a result not of the prevalence of one model over another, but, if possible, of building a model which takes on board the experience of all countries. I think that's one of the major advantages of Europe, the advantage of diversity, how to put all these elements of diversity together in a common vision. Thank you, Mr. Padoan. Now, our colleague Roy.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank all of the speakers who really enriched this debate. I completely agree with what the Minister has just said, but I'm going to try to modestly add to what he has said. I would go back to what our Irish colleagues said. We need a more efficient Europe, but it also needs to be more just. From that point of view, we need to attack inequalities in Europe. I would go back to the point that a social Europe is key, and one important point would be to ensure that there is a basic minimum wage in Europe. It would be different in every country. Obviously, it's not going to be the same in Romania or Germany, but this would be a strong signal. Likewise, to ensure youth employment, we need to take back all of the work which we've carried out on simplifying the EU. We plan to have this famous €5 billion for young people with some sort of school system. This is not used properly because the system is too complex. So we're going to ensure that there is simplification of the administrative system, and I think that these are things which we all share. We might also agree on another point. In terms of the €350 billion, we need to have strong choices in that regard. The two most important paths seem to be implementing a Europe energy and climate package. We need to have a common energy market in Europe. We need to have shared work for energy. Likewise, we need to take back all of the work that we have done on digital and research, because Europe is currently being exceeded by other states, and we need to ensure that we work on that. Our Turkish colleague also mentioned a point that I agree with. In terms of public assets today, we need to focus on health and security, security within the EU, but also security at our borders. Some states in EU, including France, intervened in Mali and in Central Africa. Turkey is part of that, and they're going to help us in combating these issues. We need to ensure that this is taken into account, that these public assets serve all European citizens, and that we need to find the means to value these. Finally, transparency. Our citizens are claiming that they are not having enough transparency on a European level. In the TEEP negotiations, we didn't have enough transparency. The new negotiations have given us more information. However, we need to ensure that the fight against corruption continues. The fight against fraud must be ceaseless. I take the example from our Greek colleagues. Large European businesses for many years that are in Greece have not paid their taxes for many years in Greece. So this is injustice against the people in Greece. This is also true for the people of Spain and Portugal and the majority of European peoples. We will not have new hope in the European dream and in the EU 2020 strategy unless we have the necessary means. I think the Minister made his point clearly. We need political will from Member States. It should be shared to ensure that we have the EU 2020 strategy guidelines.
Thank you to Daniel Roy, and now Mr. Krischbaum.
Vielen Dank, Herr.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Distinguished colleagues, there's not much time left, and therefore I won't be able to deal with all of the comments that were put forward. But I think it has become fairly obvious that most people are wondering, how can we actually achieve this 3% goal? How can we achieve it at all? How will it be possible for us to achieve recovery of our economies? How will we be able to kickstart our economies? And much was said about Greece, Portugal, Spain, and other countries particularly hard hit by the economic and financial crisis. And much was said about the practical repercussions for the people concerned in these countries. I think we have to think about this on European Union level as well. We do have a principle which is called solidarity, and we try to deal with it via our structural funds, for example. Poland, for example, within the European Union, Poland has the highest so-called absorption rate. So this means that it is in a position to define European projects and generate European money and funds. In times of the economic and financial crisis, Poland was the only European country which still had economic growth in the European Union. I mean, that has to be said. I know how difficult the situation was. I realize that, especially in Greece, even today. But we did have repercussions even before the economic and financial crisis. In the Baltic states, for example, their people had to have measures which were at least equally stringent imposed on them. This was certainly the case in the Baltic states and elsewhere as well. And all of this showed that it is possible to clean up your economic act, because the Baltic states are in a much better condition than a few years ago, and the same is true of Poland, as I already said, and Romania, for example. Romania has also done an amazing job, and I think these are examples from which we can learn, and we should learn from them. All of this is not just being said in order to make nice speeches. None of this is a purpose unto itself. Obviously, other regions of the world are not asleep while we're doing all of this. The United States of America have increased their oil production fourfold over the past years. And we have to think of the situation in that respect in Russia as well, but perhaps we'll do that tomorrow. But one thing will not change, and that is the very low energy prices, which serve the following purpose: not only the reindustrialization of the United States of America, but also, and this has to do with European competitiveness, it also means that European companies are being pulled across the Atlantic. We see an example of this in Austria, for example. You don't have to go very far. Voestalpine, a steel producer, now has production sites in Georgia, in the United States. And due to the low energy prices there, it is more than profitable to go to the United States and produce there, and then have the half-finished products shipped back to Linz in Austria and continue there. So all of this should make us think. It's not as if we were in paradise in Europe and as everything, all the problems were going to be solved for us by others. We really need to take the strategy Europe 2020 seriously for once. Often we've been asked, well, how come do this without investing any further money? Now, if I look at targets such as reducing gas emissions, or how we can make sure that fewer young people drop out of school, how we can improve university performance, how we can step up investment in research and development. Jean Bizet mentioned this as well. These are the jobs we need for the future. This is where we need to concentrate our efforts, because my colleague Friedrich said this as well, and I agree, we cannot compete with salaries and wages that are paid in Taiwan and elsewhere. So there's a simple formula which can answer this. We always have to be as much better as we are more expensive in Europe. Otherwise, we won't be able to be competitive in the future. It's the only way that we can respond to worldwide competition, and I think that it's worth fighting for this in Europe. Thank you.
Grazie. Adesso per l'ultima replica il collega Moscoso del Prado. Prego.
Thank you. The final colleague, Moscoso, please. Thank you, President. We don't have a lot of time left. For many countries in the EU, not all, the main problem is growth. From the EU alone can we solve this problem. Clearly, for countries that are not in the Eurozone, that's not the issue, but it is the issue for us in the Eurozone. We need to solve the Eurozone issue, or there's no solution to this problem. If we look at the EU Europe 2020 strategy, we see that we all recognize the objectives are not being fulfilled because, on the one hand, reforms which demand their compliance to improve productivity are not accompanied by investment. We've seen how productivity depends on labour costs, technology and energy prices. We are reducing labour costs, devaluing salaries, and in this way we're not improving in technology, we're not improving capital or energy because we're not investing enough. That is where we should be investing, and this is the despair of the South, because in the South there is no margin for manoeuvre there. The macroeconomic policy which the EU is implementing is not just for the South. It has no good theoretical basis. My good friend, Sir Lord Cash, stated that today a lot of public investment is money from taxpayers, in particular for small and medium enterprises. I also mentioned the different macroeconomic policy which exists in the UK and the US. That has led to growth. We need a new fiscal policy, a new monetary policy, certainly within the Fiscal Stability Pact and within the Stability and Growth Pact, but we need to have new and different incentives. I think what our Dutch colleague said was excellent in relation to the incentives for transparency and accountability. I think that's very important. We can all learn lessons from that. That's the way forward. We would also encourage transparency and accountability for macroeconomic policies, because I believe that the basic macroeconomic policy being applied in Europe does not work. It's incompatible. The objectives don't comply with what happens on a day-to-day basis. We have examples of this in Spain in education. I don't want to blame my own government, but it's the situation at present. We reduced by 1/3 investment in education, while at the same time we want more productivity. That makes no sense. We are not going to be competitive in that way. Certainly, countries want to be more coordinated. You're welcome to do so. Some political parties and some countries want to deepen the fiscal union and the banking union by creating economic governance in the Eurozone, which is real, even if this means seceding sovereignty. That's all. Thank you.
Grazie, ringrazio I relatori e tutti.
I'd like to thank the Speaker and all the colleagues who've taken part in this very interesting session. Dear colleagues, therefore, with this last reply, we come to the end of the first day of proceedings of COSAC. We'd like to ask the heads of delegation to stay in the hall in order to hold the chairperson's meeting, in order to consider the draft contribution conclusions. And other colleagues will be able to reach their hotels, from which there will be a departure in order to visit the National Gallery of the Ancient Art at Palazzo Barberini, followed by the official dinner, which will also be held at Palazzo Barberini. Thank you, and I wish you a pleasant evening.